The Soviet Union built like it would last forever. It built cities on the sea, reactors beside fault lines, machines that could melt metal with sunlight, and tunnels under forests meant to unlock the secrets of matter itself. Then the money ran out, the system collapsed, and some of the most ambitious projects on Earth were abandoned before they could ever fulfill their purpose. Today, we're counting down the top 9 dangerous Soviet megaprojects, too ambitious to finish. Stay until number 1, because the final project was an atomic power station almost complete, but it never split a single atom. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which sounds more dangerous, an abandoned reactor, a secret sea fortress, or the deepest hole ever drilled into Earth. Picture a flat Ukrainian landscape, open fields, pale sky, and 2 enormous radar dishes rising from the ground. One dish is massive and fixed, about 100 meters across. The other is smaller, able to turn, aimed like a weapon at the upper atmosphere. Paint peels from the metal, rust creeps along the structure. The bowls stare upward, silent, while war and time move around them. It looks like the remains of a machine built to talk to the sky. The Institute of the Ionosphere was designed to study the electrified layer of air high above Earth, the region that affects radio signals and communication around the planet. This was not a normal research tool. It was an incoherent scatter radar, one of only a small number of such systems on Earth. At full power, it could fire 25 megawatts of radio energy straight into the upper atmosphere. That made it scientifically valuable, but also deeply suspicious to anyone looking at it from the outside. A machine that heats the sky sounds like science fiction. And in the Soviet imagination, science fiction often looked uncomfortably close to military reality. Because of its power and appearance, rumors formed around the station. People imagined it as a Soviet weather control device, a secret machine capable of creating storms or disrupting armies. The source makes clear that it was not that. It was a research station. But the rumor survived because the visual was too strange. Giant dishes in a field, throwing invisible energy upward. The station required enormous electricity to operate, so even when it was active, it rarely ran at full power. The station required enormous electricity to operate, so even when it was active, it rarely ran at full power. After the Soviet collapse, funding became harder. Later, its location near conflict made its future even more uncertain. Now, the dish still points up, but the system is silent. It was built to study the sky. Today, it mostly collects rust. But if a machine that heats the sky feels strange, the next project is even more surreal. A Soviet city built in the middle of the sea. From a radar station aimed at the upper atmosphere, we move to the Caspian Sea, where the Soviets built an oil town with no natural land beneath it. Neft-Lari is not an oil platform. It is a city standing on steel legs above open water. Imagine apartment blocks, workshops, roads, a bakery, a football pitch, and a theater surrounded not by streets and fields, but by the Caspian Sea. Causeways stretch into fog. Steel supports rise from the water. Waves slap against rusting legs below structures that once looked like proof of Soviet dominance over nature. From a distance, it looks impossible. A town without ground. A city floating above an oil field. In 1949, Soviet drillers struck oil about 1,100 meters beneath the seabed in the Caspian Sea. Instead of simply building a small offshore platform, Stalin ordered a town to be built on the spot. They had no island, so they created one. Old ships were towed out and sunk, including the Zoroaster, one of the world's first oil tankers. Platforms were poured on top of the wrecks. This became the first offshore oil field on Earth. At its peak, around 5,000 people lived there, connected by more than 200 kilometers of bridges and causeways. The most disturbing detail is what has happened since. The sea has been taking it back for decades. Of the original 200 kilometers of roads and bridges, only around 45 kilometers are still considered safe to drive. The rest is slowly rusting, collapsing, or disappearing into the Caspian. This was once called the eighth wonder of the world. Now it feels like a warning from the water. Around 2,000 workers still rotate through the site on shifts. That means people still live and work inside a decaying Soviet sea city, surrounded by collapsing infrastructure and open water. Neft-Dashlari was built as an act of industrial confidence, but it now shows what happens when a megaproject outlives the empire that built it. But a city above the sea is only one kind of Soviet madness. The next project was a fortress in the water built to test weapons, then abandoned like a prison without an island. From a working oil city slowly being reclaimed by the Caspian, we moved to an empty concrete outpost built for torpedoes. Number 7. Dagdazel Workshop. Number 8. Russia. 3 kilometers off the coast of Dagestan, a windowless concrete fortress stands alone in the Caspian Sea. There is only sea, concrete, rust, and empty rooms. Inside were once a library, a canteen, and a sports hall. Crews could stay there for weeks, testing torpedoes far from shore. Dagdazel Workshop Number 8 was built as a torpedo testing station. In 1939, engineers cast a huge concrete base on shore, floated it out to sea, and sank it onto a reinforced patch of seabed. That alone is astonishing. They essentially created an artificial military outpost in open water, designed for crews to live and work offshore while firing torpedoes into the Caspian. But technology changed. By the 1960s, newer torpedoes needed deeper water than the shallow shelf around the fort could provide. So in 1966, testing moved elsewhere. The equipment was removed and the fortress was abandoned. The most haunting detail is that parts of the interior still suggest daily life. Not just weapons, not just military testing. A library, a sports hall, a place where people lived inside a weapon-testing fortress surrounded by water. That contrast makes it feel unreal. The parent factory on shore continued producing military equipment, but the offshore station was left behind. Today, only photographers, climbers, and explorers make the crossing by boat. For them, it is an adventure. For history, it is a concrete reminder that military technology can make even its own infrastructure obsolete. The Soviets built a sea fortress for one kind of war machine, then the war machine outgrew it. But an abandoned torpedo fortress is not the only Soviet ruin that feels dangerous. The next one is a half-born city built beside reactors that never came alive. Orbita was built for 20,000 people. But the nuclear future it was waiting for never arrived. In central Ukraine, near a reservoir and surrounded by forest, apartment blocks stand with dark windows and quiet courtyards. 9-story buildings rise from the trees. Roads lead toward a site where concrete stumps sit unfinished, as if construction workers simply walked away one day and never returned. The Soviets built a sea fortress for one kind of war machine, then the war machine outgrew it. But an abandoned torpedo fortress is not the only Soviet ruin that feels dangerous. The next one is a half-born city built beside reactors that never came alive. Orbita was built for 20,000 people. But the nuclear future it was waiting for never arrived. In central Ukraine, near a reservoir and surrounded by forest, apartment blocks stand with dark windows and quiet courtyards. 9-story buildings rise from the trees. Roads lead toward a site where concrete stumps sit unfinished, as if construction workers simply walked away one day and never returned. At the time of Chernobyl, there were multiple nuclear stations under construction across the Soviet Union. According to the source, only one was ever finished after that. Chaihyrin was not one of them. The result was a nuclear town without a nuclear plant, a city built around an absence. Most residents left, but around 100 people stayed. Some were later refugees who bought empty apartments cheaply. Children are bused to school outside the town. Heating in the tower blocks failed years ago. Unlike Pripyat, Orbita was not completely evacuated and frozen in one dramatic moment. It half-emptied, then kept living in a reduced, strange form. Even more surprisingly, in 2024, Ukraine's nuclear agency named this same site as a promising location for a future plant after the war, potentially using American reactors. In that point, ordinary sunlight becomes violent, bright enough to blind, hot enough to melt steel. The solar furnace at Parkand was built between 1981 and 1987. Its purpose was to create extreme heat without contamination from fuel. That made it valuable for testing materials, producing ultra-pure alloys, and studying heat shields for spacecraft. The system could focus sunlight into a spot about the width of a dinner plate, reaching temperatures around 3,000 degrees Celsius in seconds. That is hot enough to melt iron, steel, and titanium almost instantly. In that point, ordinary sunlight becomes violent, bright enough to blind, hot enough to melt steel. The solar furnace at Parkand was built between 1981 and 1987. Its purpose was to create extreme heat without contamination from fuel. That made it valuable for testing materials, producing ultra-pure alloys, and studying heat shields for spacecraft. The system could focus sunlight into a spot about the width of a dinner plate, reaching temperatures around 3,000 degrees Celsius in seconds. That is hot enough to melt iron, steel, and titanium almost instantly. But a furnace that melts steel with sunlight is only the beginning. The next project was meant to listen to deep space from a mountain, and instead became a skeleton under the weather. From concentrated sunlight in Uzbekistan, we climb higher into the mountains, where another giant Soviet scientific instrument was left unfinished. Number 4. The Sufa Radio Telescope, Uzbekistan. High on a bare plateau in Uzbekistan sits a giant radio telescope that has been almost finished for more than 30 years. Picture a lonely mountain plateau southwest of Tashkent, about 2,500 meters above sea level. The air is thin. The landscape is exposed. Snow, wind, and silence move across the structure year after year. Russia later announced plans to help finish the project, but completion dates kept moving. It was expected in 1 year, then another, then pushed again. The dish remains unfinished, catching weather instead of signals from the edge of the universe. That is the strange tragedy of Sufa. It was built to hear deep space. For decades, it has heard mostly wind. Sufa shows how science depends not only on intelligence, but on political continuity, money, and patience. A telescope can be designed by brilliant minds and placed in the perfect location, but if the state behind it collapses, the universe will have to wait. For astronomers, it is a lost opportunity. For viewers, it is one of the most cinematic ruins of Soviet ambition, a giant listening machine left deaf on a mountain. But a telescope unfinished above ground is nothing compared to the next project. A vast underground ring almost as large as one of the most famous machines in modern physics. Under a forest south of Moscow lies a 21-kilometer ring built to smash particles together, but it never accelerated a single one for its intended purpose. Above ground, the forest looks ordinary: trees, mud, cold air, silence. But beneath it runs a circular tunnel 5 meters wide, buried as deep as 60 meters underground. The Soviets began work on the Protvino Collider Tunnel in 1983. By the mid-1990s, the tunnel itself was complete. But the tunnel was only the body. It was meant to accelerate protons and smash them together at energies no machine on Earth could reach at the time. The machine still needed thousands of superconducting magnets. Only a small number were made before the money ran out. Then the need to complete its own giant collider faded. The tunnel still must be pumped and ventilated today. Why? Because if it floods, it could affect groundwater in the region. That means even an unfinished science machine continues to demand maintenance, decades after its dream died. It never became a functioning collider, but it still cannot simply be ignored. The Protvino Collider is one of the clearest examples of a Soviet megaproject that reached the edge of greatness and stopped just short. The ring was dug, the space existed, the ambition was real. But without the magnets, without funding, and without the political world that created it, the collider became a buried monument to almost. For scientists, that may be the cruelest word in engineering. Almost. But Protvino was built to look inside matter. The next project tried to look inside the Earth itself and went deeper than any hole humans had ever drilled. There is a rusted metal cap in the Arctic tundra covering the deepest hole ever drilled by humans. The site itself looks almost disappointing at first. No giant tower, no glowing tunnel, no dramatic entrance into the underworld. Just cold tundra near the Norwegian border, the remains of old infrastructure, and a welded metal cap bolted to the ground. But under that cap is a shaft that drops 12,262 meters into Earth. Deeper than Mount Everest is tall, deeper than the Mariana Trench. At the bottom, the hole is only about 23 centimeters wide. It is one of the strangest contrasts in engineering history, a tiny opening into a depth almost impossible to imagine. Drilling began in 1970. The Soviet goal was to penetrate deeper into Earth's crust than anyone before, possibly reaching toward the mantle. The target was 15,000 meters. They never made it. As the drill descended, the conditions became far stranger and harsher than expected. Temperatures rose to 180 degrees Celsius. At that depth, rock behaved less like solid stone and more like plastic. The drill struggled. Equipment failed. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, funding disappeared, and drilling stopped in 1992. The site was decommissioned in 1995. Online myths later claimed the borehole recorded sounds from hell. That story is a hoax. But the real findings are more interesting. 2-billion-year-old microfossils, and liquid water where it was not expected. Earth was stranger than they had imagined. Kola feels like a door we opened just enough to realize we were not ready to enter. But even the deepest hole on Earth is not number one. For that, we go to the Crimean coast, where a dead reactor stands between the Black Sea and a salt lake. Number one is the Crimean Atomic Station, an unfinished nuclear power plant so expensive, so close to completion, and so strange in its afterlife that it became one of the most haunting Soviet ruins ever left behind. Imagine a gray concrete structure standing alone on a strip of land between the Black Sea and a salt lake. The landscape is open and exposed. Wind moves across the steppe. The building rises like a cathedral made for the atomic age. For years, a massive construction crane towered above it. Below was a reactor hall that never held fuel. No chain reaction, no glowing core, no electricity powering Crimea. Only concrete, steel, silence, and the remains of a future that died before activation. The idea began in 1968. The plan was enormous. 4 reactors to power the entire Crimean Peninsula. By the mid-1980s, the first reactor was 80% complete. Then Chernobyl happened. Engineers identified a geological fault, and funds disappeared as the Soviet system weakened. Construction stopped in 1987. It was listed as the most expensive unfinished nuclear reactor in the world. But the strangest part came later. In the 1990s, the empty reactor hall became a nightclub and rave site for the Kazantip Techno Festival. A cathedral for music and post-Soviet chaos, it stands today as the skeleton of an empire's confidence, a building too expensive to finish, too symbolic to forget, a future canceled before the switch was ever turned on.